I hope I pronounced it right, probably not, Abhinavagupta and the levels of language. So please.
Yes, I will follow my tutor Alan in setting a timer for 28 minutes. So So it's an honor to be presenting here. I'd like to thank okay, thank you. It's an honor to be presenting here today. I'd like to thank the conveners of this Veronica conference because it's yeah, just a really fascinating subject, and I've really enjoyed everyone who's presented so far. This has been really a lot of great food for thought. I'm coming to this as a Bhartapari scholar. I've been pretty more textually based. I probably spent too much time in that sphere and not really doing the philosophical development of concepts. So I'm really looking forward to feedback on helpful paradigms or areas I should look for, maybe phenomenology or analytic philosophy that could help make this more robust. So this is kind of the basis and abstract of my paper, my project, which will hopefully be much improved after this presentation. So I'm going to be looking at how we can conceive, we're kind of going along with Bhartapari's kind of strange project of seeing, in some sense, seeing consciousness as inherently linguistic, but also, I mean, as we'll see for Bhartapari, language is actually more fundamental than consciousness. So it's kind of a strange paradigm, one that Abhinavagupta adopts, as I'm just sort of looking at that interplay. All right, and then of course the levels of language. I wasn't sure about it's a mixed group, so I wasn't sure what I'm going to refer to as the levels of language. Are these at least four? For Bhartapari, it's actually just I'd say the bottom three. Para was added later by Somananda. The great grand guru of Abhinavagupta. Also very thankful to, of course, Professor Bud and Clara and also amidst people presented on Shadowing earlier today. So it does a lot of that background is all already dealt with. I'm going to focus more on Abhinavagupta just because actually later. Anyway, the levels. So this is the terminology of the levels. Just to give a general sense of how they're thought of, for those who are not familiar with it, I've just taken a short quote from Andre Padru, whose work on mantra in Tantra is kind of it's still regarded as a solid work, so it's a good basis of definition for what they are. So the levels of the word are at the same time cosmic levels of consciousness, and stages in the development of language and of thought, or conversely, phases through which thought and speech go back to the source of the universe. Throughout his very thorough and erudite work, I just want to mention that he only talks about the levels in relation to revelation in a footnote. And that's kind of what sparked my interest in this project, was seeing the original context of the levels of language in Bhartapari, where they're primarily used with regard to evoked to kind of explain revelation. In my view, that's also something I'll have to justify textually. So I was interested in engaging in this project and looking at the levels as a model, because I feel it's been somewhat left out in the existing scholarship that has looked at them. And you find them everywhere. And also within the Tantra traditions, there's a lot of homologies involving the levels of language. So they're kind of thrown all over the place, and you find them in a haphazard way throughout the Tantra. So today I'm going to focus on what I'm going to frame as, let's say, an original context. I thought the original context of the levels has revelation. So yes, that's really the basis of my first claim, is looking back at, and I should note, sorry, this language of the levels of language first occurs in the Vakyapadya, which is belongs to Bhartapari. I have on the next slide, he's 5th century thinker. So really regarding many of the Indian thinkers that we've gone over so far in this conference, he's really quite early. That's one thing I'd like to point out. He's also he's a pre-Shankara Advaita. Sorry, that's the next slide. I'll just go my claims. What else level I've been looking at? Seeing how, as the levels were evoked in the Bhartapadiya, that it was primarily in the context of what are the stages that someone who is receiving a revealed scripture, really what are the stages of that revelation and that access that's happening to someone who could call it a rishi, a seer. So yeah, you should be seeing it in that context. Also we can describe them. I'm hoping this is the right language as a heuristic device of practice. You're saying, okay, this is how the stages you maybe ascend, like through language, you get back in contact with the divine, like kind of that last part of like the those quote I mentioned. The second kind of way that I'm looking at the levels of language and maybe their broader significance is there's well documented. There's now a lot of scholarship, of course, looking at like Torella, Marco Ferrante, Isabel Racchi, Vincenzo Vergiani, looking at this reimagination. Oh, also Najiba Nastovi, all looking at Agama, which is kind of a reformulation of Shabda Pramana, so the language as a means of knowing, looking at a way that the Shaiva thinkers following Bhartrhari kind of give this redefinition of it. And I'm going to have a slide on that later when I'm on the internalization of the word. I'm going to explain kind of what were the like philosophical moves that kind of prompted that. So I'm going to try to assert that the levels of language is just one part of this like broader project of saying, okay, Shabda Pramana isn't something coming from outside, it's something emergent from inside. Just to that. So this is, I'm not really going to come back to these because this is hopefully what the paper will be about. So especially if either of these points are left particularly unclear after this presentation, all feedback is welcome. Yeah, again, just for people maybe not familiar, for people not coming from the Indian philosophy background. So Bhartrhari, 5th century, he's really seen within the tradition of grammar. Of course, Somananda's criticism of him was, what the heck are you doing philosophy? So he was, and so Somananda being the progenitor of Abhinavagupta's tradition, so that's kind of the relationship between them. So he's a Parmenian. He also seemed to belong to some philosophic tradition. I mean, the Bronkhorst has said, the Maitreya Upanishad, maybe he's belonging to some tradition there, but other scholars have looked at him as like, yeah, some sort of a form of Advaita Vedanta. Maybe there's some similarity with the Gaudapada. I've seen a few contexts where maybe I would believe that, but that's an area of future research. And his most well-known text is the Bhaktipadya, but he also wrote a work on many history others. So Abhinavagupta, polymath, foremost exponent of Kashmir Shaivism. It's a really convenient term, but of course nowadays Shaivism is looked at under these the auspice of multiple streams. We heard about the Kama tradition earlier, as well as the Spanda. And before I forget, I'm talking about language, and really I'm talking about language or linguistic consciousness as a model of dynamic consciousness. And this is a model which exists to me in a parallel way to Spanda. So I also appreciate Claudia's presentation on Spanda. And I don't know enough about the literature about where and if they interact. I really see them more just parallel. You kind of had a Spanda system and you have this where language, para vimarshini based system. And I feel like they're kind of used to different ends in terms of explanation within the system. So anyway, regarding how I'm looking at Abhinavagupta as a representative of so many systems, I'm really mostly drawing from him as a Trika thinker and as a Pratyabhijnan thinker and practitioner. So, for Bhartrhari, kind of what am I referring to in terms of language? Again, he's known, his system is often known as a linguistic monism. Of course, you have Vach or Vach, depending. I feel like a lot of people based in India tend to use Vach and outside to use Vach. So I just want to have both of them up there for people who, kind of one is the stem and one is the declined word for people not from the Sanskrit. Speech or voice is probably the most true to form translation, but I'm going to try to include it in language. But even I will, a lot of times if you ever see speech, that's me translating this term. Shabda, lots of polysemy there. Of course, it can mean word, both lowercase and kind of maybe uppercase word. There's of course many comparisons out there with the logos of the Christian and Neo-Platonic traditions. Just on Shabda, just what language fundamentally is. Again, in our modern context, we tend to see it as something maybe socially defined or something symbolic. I just want to say that for these thinkers, what is language? It's expressive. And I think that's also the strength of a model, what they're saying. It's not sometimes Pratyabhijnan gets translated as some sort of representation, but I do think like what language fundamentally is something that's expressive, and the way that expressiveness is analyzed is in terms of it coming into being in the Vachika and the Vachya, expressor and expressed. The Sanskrit terms better, but there we go. In Bhartrhari's system, very first verse of the text, where did he start out? He asserts that Brahma exists, that this is a supreme absolute, I think is maybe the best term. And that is on par with this, what he calls Shabda Tattva. Language essence is a lame translation. I haven't found a better one, but for the sake of this talk, it'll be the language essence, just kind of keep it a bit bare bones. They're on par. This idea of like a Nirguna Saguna Brahma does not come up for Bhartrhari. He's not part of that Advaita consideration of whether you want qualities as part of Brahma. You get the term Shabda Brahma only in the commentary on the Bhaktipadya, not on the main text. And I would say in most cases, that's really a term for the Veda, not some sort of like special extra linguistic Brahma. For him, it's a linguistic absolute. A term that was very influential for the Shaiva adoption of Bhartrhari. There are two verses that not whatever. There's no sort of thought in the world that doesn't resort to language. Everything's just pierced with language. And then there's another one where he says, "Na prakasha, na prakashe, na sahi pratyabhijnan." Sorry, in the AB of that verse, it mentions Vagrupata. So this having a linguistic form. For Bhartrhari, I think this is really more referring to actually cognitive, so pretty much like a phenomenal kind of lower level of consciousness, but I think maybe in the Shaiva adoption, they actually kind of took that to a deeper or higher level of their metaphysics, and actually you have it in Bhartrhari. But it's an important term for thinking of what I would call linguistic consciousness. Now, key terms for Abhinav-Gupta. Yeah, it's already been touched on throughout this conference. I like, it was mostly Lorirai Virnaki's work of this bimodal consciousness. I'm not sure if anyone else has used this, but I like how it doesn't try to set these up as a hierarchy. These are just two modes or expression of consciousness. Prakasha was literally meaning light, divine light, sometimes that apash, like this manifestation. And then you have this like group of terms, vimarsha, pratyavarsha, amarsha, all coming from rish to like touch. And we use that even in our metaphors in English. I'll touch on that later, kind of this idea of a cognitive activity. And you have the prefixes maybe giving that a slightly different sense of, you have pratyavamarshini is again used directly in the Bhaktipadya. So maybe speaking in this term, in terms of pratyavamarshini might be something that the Shaiva has also adopted, but directly from Bhaktipadya. Many different translations of that, as you can read. It's just difficult. I can't touch on exactly how to translate it, but I feel that many works, like there's one by Tivalsina from 2020, and one other I'm forgetting, but when they try to describe it, I feel like they come close to describing really this very language. I mean, what Bhartrhari means by language in this extremely abstract and expanded definition of language. So that's why I'm, when I'm saying linguistic consciousness, I'm really referring to this Vimarsha, Pratyavimarsha aspect of consciousness. This is how we can justify it. Two, I think for the purposes of this talk, is there's so many terms to include, but aham pratyavimarsha and purna ahamta, these, I guess, the qualities of Shiva, the consciousness is the fullness, Shiva is the fullness of I consciousness, and there's an agency there. So it's an agent. It's something that's not there in Bhartrhari, as I'll touch on later. But there's some implications, especially for language and expression, that'll come up later. So I just wanted to put those on there as key terms. So these are just two quotes again, just people were maybe convinced by why I talk about linguistic consciousness. But that with reference to Bhartrhari, it's kind of well established. And I think there's many scholars who also see language as really having a special place. Abhinav-Gupta talks about so many Shaktis and so many ways of expressing that dynamism, but really language has a particular place. And I would argue because of the power of explanation it has, and one example of that is the levels of language. Important metaphysical context. When we're talking about Shakti and Shaktiman, this is an important, another type of model or framework, which we find used extensively in the Bhaktipadya, and a lot of work has been done actually by, again, Timalsina in a different article, and Ogawa in a 2009 article, looking at Bhartrhari's use of Shakti and how that was likely adopted by Abhinav-Gupta and worked into his framework. For Bhartrhari, Shakti is not divinized, it's not a deity. You get that just because of the grammatical gender, you get that in Abhinav-Gupta, but the most important thing about these is whatever is predicated as a Shakti and a Shaktiman. It can seem hierarchical, but for these systems, they try to really emphasize the ultimate abhida, that these are really two things that we're seeing, we can analyze as distinct, but in essence, they are just like fire and the power of fire to burn is one of the examples that they give. But if we're going to kind of make this distinction of what is the possessor of power, what is the power for Bhartrhari, language is the power, and language is the possessor of power, and powers like the power of time, Kala Shakti, which is in his system freedom, are said to belong to that. Abhinav-Gupta kind of inverts it because he maybe had theistic motivations. For him, Shiva is the possessor of powers, and this Paravadevi, like the Vimarsha, seen as Paravadevi, is usually seen as a Shakti of Shiva, as the holder of powers. So this is an important difference between their systems, but I don't think it's as meaningful as it otherwise could be, just because of this, that the metaphysics of Shakti and Shaktiman in these systems, where it's not trying not to arrange it hierarchically. One more model, one more structure, and I just wanted to, I'm sorry, I didn't add the translations. The reason I wanted to add this is there was actually the great Professor Alexis Sanderson. He had given a talk here a few years ago. I was watching on the Tantra, and he made this comment that Utpaladeva had kind of introduced this Copernican revolution in terms of seeing things in this. It's hard to say this triad. So for the Shaiva terms of the Pramatri, Pranaya, and Pramana, that it's seeing this intentional structure of consciousness coming into being through these three, and they're always going to exist in relation. I just wanted to bring up or add as a note to that for anyone interested in history of ideas, that I feel that revolution is really happening all the way back in Bhartrhari, because again, in the third or fourth verse of the Bhaktipadya, fourth verse, he introduces this same triad that you have the gold tree, so the subjective access. Again, you have a statement of complete non-duality, and so how is that going to come into being? through the subjective axis. So this is more like experience or experiencer, the thing to be enjoyed, the objective axis, and the boga, that relation and interrelation between the two. This is, of course, it's nice for like the visuals to have a triangular, but really there's certain intricacies of this model, like the relation is never a thing. Likewise, actually the subject can never be a thing. So it's more a matter of how can we understand phenomenality? How can we understand things coming into being? And they find that this is a kind of a helpful structure to understand that it's always got its transcendental consciousness is always going to come into being through this structure of subject, object, and the relation. Wallace has called this an epistemological triad. I'm also open to if anyone has seen these referred to with a vocabulary. I was desperately searching for a vocabulary to refer to this like system or model, which we find used extensively. Within Shaivism, I mean, especially Abhinavagupta, he has a tendency to just always go extra. So he adds, I think, Pramar, so he kind of makes this into a fourfold distinction and a fivefold distinction, but the basis of the model is again threefold, and we find this in various etymologies, throughout the system. So this is important to keep in mind. So this is both systems that I think it's helpful to understand them as emanations, I think also for Bhartrhari and for Abhinavagupta. So how does this absolute come into being? We're mostly going to be looking at the subjective axis, because I mean, Abhinavagupta is like clearly understood as some form of idealist. I would argue Bhartrhari is more a phenomenalist. Is a bit more tricky to place. But so whether you're saying that the creation is happening at an intellectual level or whether it's happening like really physically, materially, that creation is still happening from the subject outwards. So so also practices, I mean, in terms of like what do we have most direct access to in this condition, we have most direct access to ourselves as subjects in terms of only noumena that we can kind of get towards. So this, but just want to point out again a difference between the two systems, that the involution, according to Bhartrhari, is when you go beyond the not, he describes this in a text as a not of the ego, there's kind of no more agency for him, because he doesn't really have a concept of God, he's not like a theist by some of the definitions we've seen today, or during this conference. So he's fine there being no agency in that, because you've gone beyond experience. You're one with Brahma, and that's fine, you're liberated, but it's beyond all sense of personal agency and experience. For Abhinavagupta, because of his conception of Purnahanta, you still have that agency that's like kind of persisting through the subjective axis all the way back to the absolute. And so it's looking for complete identity with that would be the state of liberation, because I mean, that sense of agency and I-ness is just a place, and expanding like that, everything is really in reference to that I, that sense of I. Oh my goodness. So with the levels, this is something that really takes more time. I'm going to go over it in the paper, but really there's one verse that kind of mentions what these levels are. It just introduces this vocabulary of Prashanti, Vaikri, and Madhyama. It's strange, it's with regard to grammar being like the best thing in the world and how it will get you liberation. Okay, questionable, but the levels, this vocabulary was tantalizing enough that it was very widely adopted in the contest. Vaikri is, what you hear now. It's any sort of sound can be Vaikri. Madhyama is said to be relied more at the level of buddhi. It has really not so much sequence. It uses krama in the sense of sequence rather than system. But of course, this term krama occurs again a lot in the Vlakapadya, seeing things in terms of a non-sequential, like a transcendent aspect, and it's coming out sequentially. This is really also a key part of his analysis of how things come into being. And so it's just about to come into being in Madhyama, and there might be some subtle prana, but we can start to make some intellectual distinctions between language, so let's say the Vachaka and Vachya at the level of Madhyama, and that question D, which literally means like the visionary. This is going to be, for Abhinavagupta, it's like a seed state, but for Bhartrhari, this is already kind of that transcendental language where you really have a complete unity. And it's described in a quoted verse under this vritti as being like the stillness between the two breaths. He talks about the two breaths, and so it's that point between. So we do get to start to see some maybe yogic description of it, that this is the place where we go and revelation can happen. It's not typically, so this verse is typically not read in the context of revelation. I justified my reading by the fact that he uses trayi. So he says that traya vasha paramparam. So it's trayaha, which is the genitive of trayi. He uses it again just 10 verses earlier, and also wherever else it's used in the vritti, it's translated unproblematically as meaning Veda. He also talks about Trayanta. He doesn't talk about Vedanta. He does mention this Trayanta Vajnam. So whatever we see Trayi, it usually means Veda. In the translation of the verse, how most people read it, including Somananda, who just really tore about a new one, He said, oh, you're saying there's 3 levels of words only. So this has been a place of contention traditionally, but so that's kind of, it's a larger argument about, I can't spend as much time on, but I would say, no, Trei there is meaning Vedic. And then when we come all the way back towards the beginning of the Vakupadya, we have a statement that the Veda is really unitary, but then it comes into like along multiple paths, it comes into being. So I can see the ability, Vyajush Sama. And so in that commentary, he's talking about how you have kind of different traditions of Vedic revelation. And he uses this term sakshat prita dharmanaha prishyaha. So these steers to whom the fundamental quality of being is made directly perceptible. And of course, they say to see something, they can see the mantras. And then it gives this description of speech as like sukshma, nitya, atindriya, so subtle, eternal, and beyond the senses. And these descriptions are really similar to descriptions of Pashanti. So I see that, okay, there's some reason to read these 2 sections together. And then on top of that, the type of revelation and the tradition that follows revelation that it talks about people who see, people who understand, and people who repeat. So again, we have people who understand it at the visionary level, people who are really taking the scripture from its kind of cosmic source, people who then can maybe understand that and write smriti, write text on the basis of it, and then people who, as anyone who's maybe been to India, and I've lived in Varanasi for many years, seen many people who can chant mantra and have no idea what it means, but they're still participating in the Veda, they're still kind of part of that tradition. So it's also not necessarily being so pejorative about them. But anyway, seeing this kind of like 3-fold level, which we find in the Vritti, so the commentary on Vakupadya 1.5, as well as in Nirukta 120, there's a really similar to the definite description there. I just thought there was enough reason to maybe connect this to the place in the Vakupadya with these levels of language I first mentioned. All right. So coming now to the Abhinavagupta side and why I see, again, revelation as a helpful context to look at for the levels of language, or a place where the levels of language are useful. And I think they were seen as useful by Abhinavagupta. In his tradition, of course, these were largely discounted by Somananda. So it's interesting that basically one of the first works we have is that survive, and someone maybe can correct me, but I believe in Sanderson's like a chronology kind of reconstruction. The Malini Shloka Vartika is quite early. I know he says it's earlier than Paratrishika Vivarana, earlier than Tantra Loka, Tantra Sara, and earlier than Naprativigya, all of his commentaries, all of his more kind of at the height of his philosophical articulation. So this is what we could say like an early work of Abhinavagupta. And so we can see it as one of the first contexts or applications of the levels of language in his work. I don't think I'll have time to like actually say much more than the fact that, and there's a great study on this if anyone knows Jürgen Heneder's work, but he very inconveniently ends his work right where I wanted to. So these are my really provisional translations. They'll be, but it's just basically you get the mention of Paravach, you get the mention of the Pashanti and Madhima, which he groups together as an intermediary level. And then so after this point, after he introduces that, then he introduces what's the kind of again, very esoteric Shiva revelation, right, which is split into the 5 phases of Shiva, and there's combinations of them. So some are revealed by Bhairava, some are revealed by Rudra, some are revealed by Shiva. So he's explaining that, which again is happening at the Madhyama level. So this structural distinction is already happening before anything's spoken. This is kind of again the power of this model. That okay, you have something ultimately unitary, that source of revelation. It can come into being maybe in different recessions, but again, that's going to stay there. That structure is there. And then finally, so you see like there's about 8 verses later is when he mentions Vaikari, and he's like, okay, we get the audible language. Again, he kind of closes out this section, saying that really it's just the scripture on the nature of consciousness, the very nature of consciousness, because of the structure of reality. That's why I mentioned that model earlier with the Kamar 3.3. It's really just part of our nature, being consciousness. And then I was also very happy to see that he's using this term of vacha, about this expressor and expressed, because in many, I'm about to show a table, and it's definitely hardly original because this is how many people see these levels of language, but I just think it's interesting to see it again in this clear context of Shiva revelation. Oh yeah, because, sorry, Bharata Hari's problem with revelation was Veda is one, but obviously we have multiple Vedas. Abhinavagupta's problem is there's many tantric revelations. You kind of have to reconcile how there's just so many different. If it's all true, it's all really revelation. And of course, these are thinkers preoccupied with this being a true revelation. You don't want to say Sanketika or Vikalpa. You don't want to say that this is conventional or imaginary. So having these structures is kind of helpful to them on a theoretic level. So as this again, this is more an Abhinavagupta system. As these are coming apart, I mean, I don't think it's a one-to-one comparison necessarily, but the expressor to me kind of seems like on the subjective axis of reality, and that Vacha is the more objective axis. And then you see the relation, again, that's Pramana. So if you're going to Pramatri, Prameya, Pramana, it's this relationship is kind of changing as you kind of come into being. And so you get this increased diversification and then separateness as you kind of come towards the Vaikari level. But this is a model that kind of explains that how they're ultimately unitary here. And I feel like for Abhinavagupta Para, there's kind of just no question of it. It's beyond. I'll have to because yeah, just in terms of understanding motivations of this system, and this is something that's much more clear in Bhartrhari than in Abhinavagupta, but in line with what I was just saying about you don't want revelation to be seen as something imaginary or just part of whimsy and fantasy. And Bhartrhari was very committed to the Vedas are correct, Sanskrit is correct. So you have sadhutva and nitya of certain Sanskrit words, which actually have a causal relation with reality. The rest of the language can be conventional, but he's going to believe that there are these structures. And that's really, and I said in here somewhere that really his model is so calcific. But who were his discussants? Who was his Purva Paksha? I'm almost positive it was some sort of Mimamsa conceptualization. And this is a bit of a cartoon of Mimamsa. I haven't read that much, a little bit of Shabada Pasha, haven't touched Kumarila, but anyway, before Kumarila. But they want not only, in other words, its focus of the Veda is authorless, but on top of that, it's the Adhikarana. Where is the Veda? It's in space. And this affected their cosmological view because like you can't have cycles of creation and destruction because then space would be destroyed and the Adhikarana of the Veda would be destroyed and it's eternal. So this became this like really weird motivation. And so what Bhartrhari is doing, okay, and also Mimamsakas or any realist will say, okay, we can have our nice chit chat, that can be kind of mental or interior, but when we're talking about the Vedas, it needs to be stable, it needs to be eternal, it has to be objective. So they have this like real obsession with it being outside. I think Bhartrhari's main project in the Bhakti-Padya, especially the Brahmakant, because he seems obsessed at some points of making this point, is about taking this internal regular linguistic structure inside the subjective axis of reality. And Spota is actually just a small piece of that. It again gets banged around left, right, and center. I don't think Spota is that important for Bhartrhari's metaphysics, but it's an example of this putting the structure of what the word is inside the speaker, inside, and not just any structure, but the correct structure, the structure which will give birth to the Veda at the Vaikari level. So yeah, so that's kind of like his big list. And yeah, coming kind of back to Revelation, what does that mean? The Veda speaks through us. It's not that we hear the chanting and okay, so then it's becoming an object, and that's how it's acting as a pramana. Someone is chanting it, it's eternal, someone's someone's manifesting it, it can become an object, and then we can be informed by it, the Chodana, okay, you do this. It's saying no, the Veda is gonna potentially, if you're a special person, and Bhartrhari also admits that, okay, it's for very special people, very purified people purified by grammar, so everyone get out your Ashadhyay, then it's possible. And so then coming to, again, this contemporary work on looking at Shabda Pramana, you already have in Bhartrhari this kind of as part of this focus on Pratibha. He has several famous verses where he's really critical of Anumana and of inference and then perception, saying, it's just always kind of guessing, and even in science, even science self-admits it's about having the best possible hypothesis that's fitting the evidence. Something could come along and change that. So he tries to argue really having this kind of intuition is internally situated. Maybe 3 4 minutes. Having this is actually a much stronger, much more reliable source of knowing. This is just showing some of the vocabulary that they talk about this in. Can't go into that. Yeah, I won't go into that. Yeah, and so why having this kind of re-articulation of the means of knowledge in the subject, we can see this makes a lot of sense for both of them as idealists and phenomenalist thinkers, because actually perception does not make sense as a means of knowing in an idealistic system. It's just the object isn't there to be like that source of, okay, I know it's a notebook because the notebook's really there. If I'm creating the notebook, we kind of need to have a different means of knowledge. And this, in Bhartrhari, I did my doctoral work on Jati, and so this is basically his whole premise that actually the language universal is what we're projecting to become the object. So even so, it doesn't make sense to posit a pre-existent object prior to language to be the basis of our knowledge. That's just like a few notes on this kind of reorganization of Shabda Pramana. But given that, okay, Shabda Pramana, if you'll let them have it and say it's internal, then again, the structures of the language of levels of language are something that help make it seem less capricious than other people might see it. All right, just 2 practices, just so that I think somewhere actually I mentioned practices. The Shabda Purva Yoga, Marco Ferrante has an article on it. This seems to be Bhartrhari's conceptualization of what is the practice associated with getting back to Pashanti. but it's complex. And I think within Abhinavagupta, this is his description of Shambhavupaya, which is in the Divine Means, which is in Tantraloka Anika 3. It's where he's describing these letters. And again, if he's going to say, I think we're talking about it, we're going to talk about a letter of Matrika. So he talks to the Matrika, then that can't be what I just, it can't be that, it has to be something subtle. So again, this model is really helpful for Abhinavagupta in the context of this practice of saying, okay, there are subtle matrices that some people can kind of access and deal with in their practice. Okay, I'm gonna ignore this. That's very kapcha. I don't really know where this is going to end, so I will end there. I hope there's maybe some relevance. I would like to hear from you. What do you think this is potentially relevant to? So thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have 15 minutes of discussion.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. Perhaps I missed something, probably I did. But if you could elaborate a bit more about the key term of your talk, linguistic consciousness.
Linguistic consciousness.
Yes.
So I mean, it's linguistic consciousness and looking at it through I tried to make a small argument for it just to get people to buy on. I guess the main thesis is more about the levels of language as a distinct access to this linguistic consciousness. So within a linguistic system, which is positing like linguistic consciousness, or whichever we say, but linguistic consciousness, having something like the levels of language is, I guess, like a roadmap to that direct access. Like, how do we get from this diversified state of consciousness, which again, in a Shiva system is still real, this diversified state, but how do we get to a unitary state of that, which is, one Shiva, or to transcend it?
Okay, so it's a kind of way through language to get to this like higher state of consciousness. Is that what?
Yes, that's part of it. It's also just a totally reconceptualization of what language is. We tend to primarily see language as something, that creates this division, or even earlier, we'll say colloquially, oh, it transcends language. But really, it transcends our ability to put it into Vyavaharika, into like worldly language, into conversation. But what they saw as language, kind of as an activity, dynamism of consciousness, is something which has that structure of okay. Oh, see that table of where you have
Sure.
so it's about saying, okay, this is fundamental to the structure of consciousness. So as you practice, you're going to go back to a unitary source of consciousness through these realms.
Thank you. Further question?
That was brilliant. Did you say at some point that there was a notion of language agency? We talked about what kind of word, Shabdamat or something like that. Did you say something like that? That there's an agency in language itself, which is strange because Varch is often
No, that agency is only this conceptual, that agency there. I think within Bhartahari, the agent would be at that kind of vocatory level, that whatever you want to call the agent is actually part of phenomenality. And for him, he's perfectly comfortable saying in liberation, we don't need that.
okay.
With me. Okay. So if I understand correctly, Somananda criticizes Bhartahari. And then Utpaladeva brings in this kind of like doctrine of language into the Vijna.
Yeah.
So what is Somananda's like disagreement with Bhartahari, and like what are the why does Utpala bring in this doctrine? Like what does it do fundamentally?
I did not answer this as well as Rafaela Torella. In the 2008 article, I was just anyone could make the main arguments for that. Okay. I quickly reskim the Shiva Drishti, but it boils my blood because he just has such a cheap view of Bhartahari and the levels of language. He says, why? He exactly basically reduces all language to Vaikri. So he's like, why are you talking about the supreme? He talks about Pashanti, what does she see? He's like, oh, well, what does she see? There must be an object and not understanding metaphorical language. So Somananda just kind of takes these cheap shots, or I feel like there must have been something else to motivate him. There's just, we have no, Somananda is maybe 8th century. But so you have it's 250-year gap. No text that kind of mentions the levels, or as far as I know, nothing mentions. The only kind of later talk about stuff would mention it. So we don't know kind of who were the type of people talking about this. Maybe they were very annoying and they got on Somananda's nerves. So he's like, let's just chop this guy down. But then I think Baladeva, maybe for the sake of Pratyabhya system, Najib Angostoli mentioned that he sees the levels as kind of somehow inspiring or leading to the doctrine of identity, like having talk about theology in terms of that. I don't myself see the connection quite yet, but that may have been an inspiration for Veronica to then kind of resuscitate it. And I just think Abhinav Gupta is like kind of even more. There's like even more parity between Abhinav Gupta and Parth Price. That's why I kind of skipped over to. Okay, thank you so much.
Further question?
I'm wondering with Abhinav Gupta, the theistic framing that comes more so later on, whether that then couples in with the creativity of language. It's not just a path to transcendence, but something manifest A from a theistic perspective, but B maybe from the individual as well.
Maybe also for the individual, and in terms of practice, maybe someone operating a Shambhavi might be the case for them. For sure, at the level of the divine me, it employs the levels when he's later on when he's talking about the it's called the phonomatic emanation. That really reality, this is creativity of language coming into being. I don't know enough about how he describes Shambhavi, if that's also true of the individual, but that would again be something for Tantraloka Panditagri. Then it might be described in more detail of kind of does that mean that we also have this creativity? I mean, at a very obviously it's what gives us creativity. I think that's the strength of language. As again, if we're talking about that dynamism, why is language? Because we can see agency in language, you can see will in language, you can see creativity in language, you can see knowledge in language, you can see structure in language. So language is as a model for what that dynamism is very powerful. You kind of pile a lot on top of it, and you can use it for many explanatory ends.
Thank you, Veronica.
Oh, thank you so much.
One thing that
Oh, yes.
just to clarify, because I'm trying to put the pieces together. So just for my edification, you have the linguistic consciousness, right? Is that somehow kind of a fundamental reality or something, or is linguistic something that's properly of the consciousness in some way? How does it work?
It might not work for everyone, but for Art it's fundamental. And maybe again, and it was actually this quote of the Shakti and Shaktiman being on par. That was actually Somananda. I didn't include it here. There's a very clear quote that it's like they're not. We can talk in these terms, but it's not to say that it's not like a Draviguna sort of relationship or Pritana Guna where one is kind of under and one is over. It's the whole point of we have something that is actually impossible to put into this type of language. And so we're going to have to talk about it in some way. And then we want to talk about these two, like Prakasha and Vimarsha, like you're going to want to put it into two terms. And so that's how I'm saying this linguistic consciousness, it's fundamental. Or in the Shiva system, maybe you could say, okay, Shiva is there as consciousness and Shakti is there as the Parava, as baby.
I mean, I may have another question. We still have. Okay. I just had to think about the Greek logos tradition all the time. So, do you see a relation there between?
I didn't mean because I'm not that well versed in that tradition. So whatever I would have said in this would be very superficial. David Peter Lawrence, he has a lot of excellent work on seeing the logos and the work of the actual Platonic. I think there could be some, maybe even Platonic. It's funny, but gut feeling is in that Neoplatonic tradition that could be really nice.
Okay. So then, thank you very much.